I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education in the Office for Equity and Diversity, and welcome to Limiting Liberty, the Recurring Collision of Free Speech and Religion, our third conversation in this year's Critical Conversations about Diversity and Justice. The Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the university libraries. The libraries have developed a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. We're now starting the fourth year of offering these conversations, and we're excited to continue offering live streaming so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived on that Critical Conversations webpage. And we've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series. If you signed in, we'll email a link to an online evaluation, or you can access that evaluation on the webpage. As with all of our conversations, we'll start with some discussion among our panelists and moderator, and then move out for Q&A in the audience. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator and my colleague with whom I work closely, Kimberly Hewitt. Kimberly Hewitt is the Director of the Office for Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action here at the University of Minnesota and the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Office for Equity and Diversity. Prior to coming to the university in the fall of 2007, she served as Assistant Dean for Students and Multicultural Affairs at Hamline University School of Law. Ms. Hewitt has 14 years of experience practicing law in the areas of employment, labor, and education. She is previously a partner in the law firm Ryder Bennett and has served as an in-house attorney for the Minneapolis Public Schools. Ms. Hewitt holds an AB from Stanford University and a JD from the University of Minnesota. Please welcome our moderator, Kim Hewitt.
Thank you, Ann. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see a lot of people here. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and I'll start with the person closest to me. Fedwa Wazwaz is a Palestinian American born in Jerusalem, Palestine, and raised in the United States. In 2001, she co-founded the Islamic Resource Group, an outreach organization that seeks to build bridges of understanding through education between Muslims and the greater Minnesota community. She also leads EngageMinnesota.com, a program to foster dialogue between Muslims and non-Muslims. She has completed training in restorative justice at the University Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking. She was a Your Voices blogger for the Star Tribune for over 6 years. She was also a 2008-2009 Policy Fellow at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs. So we're pleased to have Fedwa with us today. Then to her left is Dr. Suda Aishida, who is a professor of communication studies and the director of the Certificate in International Journalism program at Hamline University. Born and raised in Bangkok, Thailand, Suda worked as a teacher in an Indo-Chinese refugee camp run by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Thailand right after her graduation. She went on to become a news reporter in several Bangkok-based media organizations, including the Nation daily newspaper and the Associated Press, Bangkok Bureau. Professor Aishida earned a master's in international communication from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and a PhD in mass communications and journalism from the University of Iowa. Her research focuses on mass media in Thailand, globalization, and social movements. Her courses at Hamline include Introduction to Critical Media Studies, Mass Communication, Media and Global Perspective, Media and Global Environmental Conflicts, Intercultural Communication, and Global Advertising. She also writes in the Thai language as a columnist for a Thai nonprofit media website called Media Inside Out. And I should also mention that she and I spent many Saturday mornings together at the Suzuki program at McPhail watching our daughters play the violin, so it's a nice little reunion for us. Next, on her left, we have Steve Sack. Steve is a liberal-leaning American cartoonist who won a 2013 Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning. With Craig McIntosh, he draws the cartoon activity panel Doodles, and he is editorial cartoonist for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, where he started in 1981. Both Doodles and Sack's editorial cartoons are distributed by Creators Syndicate. He was born in St. Paul, and his newspaper career began while attending the University of Minnesota, where he illustrated features and drew editorial cartoons for the Minnesota Daily. 2 years later, he was hired as staff cartoonist for the Journal Gazette in Fort Wayne, Indiana. After 3 years, Zach returned to Minnesota to join the Star Tribune. He is featured online by Daryl Cagle, another editorial cartoonist, who says, quote, "Steve Zach is a wonderful cartoonist. He draws in a painterly, colorful style that is like no other cartoonist. I think of Steve as a stealth cartoonist because his drawing style is sweet, young, and charming, but the sweet look is deceptive. Steve is actually one of the harshest cartoonists, skewering his political targets with little mercy." Sachs Interactive became the most popular thing on the Cagle website. It was introduced in 2000 and caused problems for the web servers because of the high volume of visitors in 2005. So we welcome Steve Zach. And then last but not least, Heidi Katroser is a professor, joined the University of Minnesota Law School faculty in 2006. She was a visiting professor at the law school from 2005 to 2006 and an assistant professor at Brooklyn Law School from 2003 to 2006. Professor Katroser is an expert on the constitutional law of federal government secrecy and on separation of powers and free speech law more broadly. She has written, spoken, and consulted widely on these topics. Her book, Reclaiming Accountability, Transparency, Executive Power in the U.S. Constitution, was published in 2015 by the University of Chicago Press. It was awarded the 2014 Illinois Chicago-Kent College of Law Roy C. Palmer Civil Liberties Prize. She has also authored numerous law review articles. Professor Katroser graduated from UCLA in 1992, summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in political science. She received her JD degree from Yale Law School in 1996. During her third year of law school at Yale, she won the Harlan Fiske Stone Prize for Best Oral Argument in the Morris-Tyler Moot Court of Appeals. Following law school, she clerked for Judge William Rea on the District Court for the Central District of California and for Judge Judith Rogers on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. She also worked as an associate at the Washington, D.C. office of Jenner and Block. So we also welcome Professor Katroser. So, as Ann indicated, we're going to start by having the panel ask some pre-prepared questions, and then we'll have some time at the end for you to ask the panelists questions. So, and feel free to answer in whatever order or go in the order that you would like. So, there have been several events on our campus over the last year and some in more recent months that have sort of demonstrated this tension between the institution's desire to maintain a welcoming campus climate for all our community members and seeing that tension arise with respect to also our desire to support free speech. So I'm just going to briefly highlight some of the things that have happened for our panelists and for some of you. So in the prior school year, a student group held an event where they invited students to draw cartoons of Muhammad. That actually through, I think, some good discussions between the student groups. There was some good conversation and positive resolution, but, you know, again, a difficult situation. Last school year, a group of faculty held a panel discussion about the Charlie Hebdo killings, and in promoting the panel discussion, they used the picture of Muhammad that appeared on the cover of the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and there were, you know, many people who were not happy about that, and others who felt that any opposition to that was an opposition to free speech. Also, more recently, there was a speaker at the University of Minnesota Law School who'd come from New York Law School. He was a speaker who's lectured widely on the ethics of war, and specifically with respect to Israel. And a group of students from a student group, pro-Palestine student group, interrupted the speaker, I mean, according to news reports, which, you know, we never know, for 45 minutes or so. So there was this idea of interrupting speech and using speech to do that. So those are just some examples of things that have happened on our campus. I'm sure I didn't cover everything, but I think those are just some examples of things that people might be thinking about. So my first question for the panelists is just kind of share your thoughts about how the university might approach this issue of wanting to really endorse our values about a positive campus climate, and how do we balance that with free speech rights? So whoever would like to start.
I think I can go first, probably. That's okay. Because first off, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure. And then, first thing I really want to emphasize is freedom of speech, freedom of expression is a recognized international basic human right. I really want to emphasize this. However, when we are given the freedom, oftentimes we take it not as seriously, we take it as entitlement. So, what comes with freedom? Responsibility. So, they oftentimes we have to be aware of that fact. However, of course, some people, when we are given the freedom, we can use it wisely. Oftentimes, a lot of people don't know how to use it wisely. I think you agree with me, right? So how are we going to strike that balance and think about it? In the world, this is the world that is constantly changing and changing very rapidly based on the communication and technology that has been rapidly developed. If you take a look carefully, the landscape completely changed. In the past, since because I studied the history of mass media from different generations, you see, we used to have what pamphlets, right? And we have the penny press, we have the radio, we have television. Right now, we have the internet that connects people everywhere in different parts of the world if they have access into the internet, right? So there are a lot of images, information that being shared all over the place freely. So this is the context I really want people to think about. One is the freedom of expression that we should encourage. Why should we? Because freedom of expression and freedom of speech is basic human rights and extremely important to a democratic society, right? Without it, people will find very limited ways to express their viewpoints and opinions. That by itself, if we limiting those, it could come back and hurt us as well. So this is the big picture that I really want people to understand, all of my audience here to understand. Next, what is considered offensive can be perceived and interpreted differently based on different cultures, right? What I see, for example, can I give you an example from Bangkok, Thailand a little bit, if you don't mind? The image of the head of the Lord Buddha, Buddha head. In our country, the image of Lord Buddha, the head, is not appropriate, simply just the head. You have to see the entire body. But in Western media or somewhere else outside of the country, you see the head and then put somewhere, even in someone's living room. Okay. And these days, if you go to some restaurants, they even have the soap in the shape of the Buddha head. What do you think? Right? So we perceive and interpret the same, exactly the same thing, completely different. The other example, yoga pants. I think you've heard about this. I'm not trying to make this funny, but I want you to see the example of how exactly the same thing, the same image, the same word, the same information can be perceived vary across the world. Am I making sense? I think so. So this is something we ought to understand. Okay. And now let's take a look at, think about us as part of the global culture where the diversity is increasing. Take a look at the increasing demographic changes around the world. You see that? I would say in Minnesota 50 years ago, maybe predominantly Norwegians and Germans. If you walk around Minneapolis, what do you see? Completely different. So the world is changing in the way that oftentimes, if nobody points that out to us, we might not notice it, right? When somebody points that out to us, then we start to think and realize it a little bit more. And it's even more difficult when we are in the group of what we consider or they consider the dominant group, right? When you dominance, for example, when I was in Bangkok, Thailand, I was part of the Buddhist. And I'm sorry, I have to tell you this. I used to make fun of Jesus Christ quite a little bit when I was, you know what I mean? When you're part of the dominance group, there's the tendency for you or for us to do so without realizing it, without realizing that the world is changing rapidly, that we ought to have that awareness. Beyond the awareness, we also need to have the tolerance and the empathy. This is something oftentimes we miss it because it's difficult for us to imagine how the other people would feel the pain. How would exactly the same message could be considered harmful? We think we could laugh at something because it's just funny. But the same humor, especially humor is not cross-culturally very well. Could be perceived as being offensive, but I just told you guys, right? What's considered offensive is also embedded in particular cultural context as well. This is what I want you to think, and then I'll leave you one thing to think about, and then I'll let my other panelists to talk. When I'm talking about time change, things change, I am serious. One last example I want to give it to you. The song, The Beatles, I don't know if you've heard, quite a few of you might like the Beatles. Have you heard of the song Run for Your Life? Came out in 1970, very popular, a lot of people love it. The first sentence of the song is, I'd rather see you dead than be with another man. Can we sing this song today? It's gonna be quite difficult to hear. Now I'll leave you with this, and I don't have any answer yet on how to strike the balance. You can tell I'm not answering the question at all.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you for inviting me to speak. I just want to first say that one of the challenges we face as Muslims in the US is whenever we speak, there's the impression that I speak for 1.5 billion Muslims across the world. So I just want to say I'm here speaking for myself. And a lot of Muslims probably disagree with what I'm going to say today. So just to keep recognize that I'm not speaking on behalf of God. I'm not speaking on, the behalf of the prophets. I'm not speaking on even the Muslim community at large in the US. I'm just sharing my views, my experience as a Muslim American that was raised here, that was born in Palestine, based on all the different experiences that I faced, the different challenges that I have faced. So those are just my views. Probably other Muslims would totally disagree with me. Some of them might probably be 180 degrees totally different. So just to kind of keep that in mind, that I represent myself here today. And I say that because every time when I became a blogger for the Star Tribune, and people know me now, I'm a very direct speaker. So I will just say authentically, genuinely, what I feel, what I believe. I put myself out there and I expect to be challenged in return, though. I don't go there thinking that I have the truth, I'm going to put it out there and I'm going to fix the greater community. But rather, this is where I am at today. So if you met me years ago when I started college in Knoxville, Tennessee, I remember Salman Rushdie affair happened at that time. While I didn't agree at the time that he should have had a fatwa against him, being raised in a secular home, not knowing Islam, not knowing even anything at that time about the religion, I was very antagonistic about Salman Rushdie. I just basically barely started understanding the faith. Now, if you ask me, years after all that experiences, and she talked about the world is changing and how we change, those views kind of change, and I recognize going into it and coming out of it that we have to enter the conversation not with this enlightened person who has all the answers and solutions to the world, but as I want to challenge others, we want to challenge Muslims, we want to challenge the right to paint, Prophet Muhammad, then we also, and I also have to be challenged in return. I was challenged throughout my years growing up in the US, and I grew out of that challenge as my co-panelist here also. So we have to enter the conversation with a level of openness, and that collision sometimes is really within our mind. It's not really so much out there as much as in our mind. A resistance to be challenged. We want to challenge but not be challenged. We want to offend but not be offended. We want to fix but not have anyone kind of share or contribute something that may be beneficial to our growth. So I think that's where the collision is. It's how we enter the conversation. We don't enter it with an openness to grow, an openness to be challenged, and to allow the truth to emerge, which is probably from the union of all of us communicating together openly. But we rather go into it with a desire to fix. So a lot of people in my community are like, Fedwa, be careful what you say. Make sure you smile the right way. Make sure you do this the right way. You have to say how we look like everybody else, how we liked everything of this. You can't say anything different. Make sure, you temper your words. Make sure you do this. So I was kind of like put in a corner where be careful what you say, because anything you say is going to be perceived as a representation of the 1.5 billion Muslims across the world. And if you breathe the wrong way, it's going to affect all of us. So that was really some of the challenges as a blogger that I faced. I could deal with the people who hated Islam and mocked me on the blog, but I had the pressure of having to deal with my own community being extremely afraid of my blog. I would repeat in my blog, I speak for myself. I speak for myself. But people were so afraid every time I posted my blog that they would really harass me and tell me, what are they going to think? What are they going to say? You have to breathe the right way. And I mentioned that when I was talking about distinguishing between free speech and hate, that at times the minority group is put into this corner where they have to breathe the right way, sneeze the right way, talk the right way. And if they act like, human and I'm a doofus one day, then it's like, everybody is going to be criticizing the entire Muslim world, And that's, I think, where the challenge is. The challenge is that we're human beings, we're vulnerable. There are times that I say the right things, there are times that I don't say the right things, and I expect to be challenged back, and that's how I enter the conversation. And if we enter it in any other way, then I think that's where the collision takes place. We need to enter it openly, allowing ourselves to grow, opening ourselves to growth, recognizing that faith and free speech together can work to help us solve our problems, and they can be used to create problems that really are more from our own egos than based on free speech or religion. Thank you.
All right, well, is this on? Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here. And I think among the many really important things that the first two speakers said, I think one thing that each got across very well was a fact that's simple but very, very easy to lose sight of, which is that we're each obviously coming from some particular perspective, right? No speaker represents sort of universal truth, right? Or the truth of the truth or the one viewpoint of their particular community. We each have a particular perspective stemming from our own experiences. And I guess I should say at the outset, my perspective when it comes to free speech tends to adhere close to what you might call sort of old-fashioned liberal, sort of ACLU type free speech values. But what I'd like to say, specifically in that respect, and specifically engaging from that perspective, the question that Kim had raised about, how might we reconcile those kinds of free speech values with concerns about religious insensitivity and religious hurt, right? The very, very real kind of hurt that we just heard about, as well as the very real kind of damage that individuals can feel when they're stereotyped or mocked based on religion. How do we reconcile those things? And again, coming from my sort of classical liberal perspective, I do come from the starting point that I am always extremely uncomfortable with anything smacking of, let's say, content-based speech restriction or a speech restriction based upon offense, particularly at the university, which, I think, as the Supreme Court once said, is sort of peculiarly meant to be a marketplace of ideas. That said, I think we have to step back and say, well, why do we value free speech? And that gets to something Fatwa said that I think is really important when she said that from her perspective, she wants to be challenged, and she thinks it's very important for people to challenge each other because it's through that collision of experiences and perspectives and resulting ideas that we might be able to come up with perhaps some better ideas than we might be able to come up with, and some understandings than we might come up with if we remain in isolation, right? And I think that is the reason many of us, to whatever degree, value free speech. I think at some level that sort of encapsulates the very ideals of a university. And so I think that it's not enough to say, gee, the university, it would be problematic for a university to impose restrictions on what students can say or what student groups can decide to say or decide not to say. But to say, what are the reasons for that, right? What would be the reasons for valuing free speech in that way? And I think it's important to keep sight of the fact that while the underlying idea is that we hope through that collision of ideas and that type of open dialogue, even at risk sometimes of offensive speech, that we'll have a productive discussion or productive series of discussions. And I do think that one thing I observe today at universities and even more generally in public discourse that I do think is that I do find problematic is that oftentimes you'll hear people saying, this speech restriction is bad. I have a right to say what I'm going to say. But then they tend to conflate criticism of what they're saying with censorship of what they're saying, right? So I feel like too often I'll hear the same people or the same group saying, I have a right to say X or Y. I have a right to put out this poster. And then in the next breath saying, and that group criticized me. They're trying to censor me. Whereas I'm with them on the first part. But on the second part, I say, wait a minute. The whole point in saying, yeah, you have free reign to speak is so that there can be dialogue, so that there can be pushback, so that there can be discussion. The two censoring versus counter-speaking are not one and the same. In many ways, they really serve very opposite ends. So I guess to bring it back then to Kim's question, I would say, just to kind of give a thumbnail sketch of how I would approach these very difficult kinds of conflicts is that, I have sort of a visceral allergic reaction to anything that does smack of a content-based or viewpoint-based speech restriction, or one defined by what's perceived as offensive. But by the same token, I am all for applying that, on both sides, both to those who are claiming the initial right to speak and those who, want to engage in some kind of counter speech. I also think the university and university leaders and department heads themselves have roles to play, very viable, valid roles, legitimate roles to play as speakers in the marketplace of ideas. And so I think that while I would find it problematic where universities say, X or Y group can't use this word or use this image, I'm all for the university saying through deans or others, but we have a viewpoint. And here's our viewpoint. We're going to have a day in which we have dialogues that put forth our commitment to equality, or that convey our commitment to free speech, or to hearing the viewpoints of those who are hurt or offended by certain symbols and displays. So again, I guess, really two key takeaways in terms of where I'm coming from and my perspective. One is pretty anti-restrictions, but two is very embracing of counter speech, including criticisms of this, of that speech for which there may be calls for censorship. Thank you.
Hello. I'm Steve Sack. I used to do cartoons for the Minnesota Daily. Some of the best years of my life. And be sure to check out Leah Graber's cartoon in this issue. It's very good. I speak for my when I is this working? No? Did I break it? Should I start over? I do speak the one true truth. I have drawn over 9,000 cartoons, one a day, for 34 years. And some of them were smart, some of them were stupid, some were right, some were wrong, some were found to be offensive by some people. A lot were found to be offensive by some people, some by my mother. My point is that when you express yourself, there are going to be people who disagree with you, and some will really extremely disagree with you. But that's part of free speech. That's part of our culture, and I'm kind of a free speech absolutist in that regard. When you put your thoughts or your feelings or your opinions out there, you have to expect that people will react. Hopefully they'll agree with you or change their mind and agree with you and think that you're wonderful, but that's not always the case. For what I do, I regularly receive angry phone calls or emails, or my boss gets angry calls saying that I should be fired or things like that. I mean, it's just part of being in the media, especially in the opinion media. But what I do, I'm not an expert in any area. I'm not an expert in history or foreign policy or social issues or anything like that. I'm just a person. I only know what I read in the newspaper, and I form opinions and I express them just like everyone here. You talk to your friends or your coworkers, or in a bar, you'll talk to somebody about what you see on the TV. Everyone's got an opinion, and a lot of those opinions aren't all that wise. It would be nice if they were, but they're not. It's a big world. So I guess what I would suggest in terms of the university handling these issues would be to emphasize the message that people have many viewpoints. Many of them you will find offensive. Many of them you'll agree with. But when something offends you, the answer is not to shut them down or demand something be removed. It's to answer it with your own speech, with your own words or letters or emails. And that's how you respect someone else's viewpoint. And even if you don't respect their viewpoint, you can still listen to them.
Thank you. So my next question is related, and I think Fatwa touched on this a little bit when you talked about this desire to get to an answer. But what do you think it is about this tension or collision that exists sometimes between free speech and religion that makes it so difficult for us to navigate?
I think the tension really exists because we see it as two adversarial camps, and I don't see it as two adversarial camps. You know, I'm a Muslim faith, and I also like free speech. Like I've been a blogger, and I'm also promoting free speech. I don't see it like I belong in this world or that world. I think the tension really, like I said, has to do with our openness and how we enter the conversation. Do we enter the conversation to justify and rationalize the oppression of others? And then we do so in a platform where we know that those that we're talking about, they do not have the opportunity to respond. So it's easy to say, and I respect Steve Sack, by the way, it's easy to say to respond that we must challenge ourselves in a university. And I challenged myself that as a blogger. The person or group that I'm talking about, I asked myself, do they have equal or greater platform to respond? If they have equal or greater platform to respond, by all means, express your view. If they do not have equal or greater platform to respond, then do not speak openly in the public square about them, because what you're doing is you're engaged not in it's free speech, but it's free speech not to open dialogue, but free speech to dehumanize others. Religion likewise can do the same thing. Just because you belong to, I'm a Muslim faith, and we've just seen the Paris attacks, it can be used to create problems. It can be used to manipulate. It can be used to harm. Just because I belong to the Muslim faith, it doesn't mean that everything everyone says about Islam is okay. You have to challenge, and you have to tell some people, be silent, because you are using religion to harm others. So I think the tension is, how do we enter the conversation? People throughout history of many faiths used free speech within their group and within other faith groups, and they worked fine. The tension comes in when we enter the conversation and we communicate with each other, whether it is just within the Muslim community, within the Christian community, within, across differences of faith, across differences, even within my own family. When you come into the conversation with the intention to dehumanize, to subjugate, to control another. So sometimes the issue is not so much why won't the others respond back, but that platform, that equal platform that allows the people that we're talking about over and over and over again do not have that opportunity to respond and to be heard. So we can be speaking to the masses about Muslims, and then Muslims will have a little whimper here, a little blog here, and it doesn't really it's not a kind of a fair conversation. It's not a fair kind of exchange of ideas, a fair exchange of free speech. It's not going to lead anywhere other than to having negative perceptions of Muslims, negative stereotypes. And while those stereotypes may be true in some cases, we do see people, doing these type of things, but they're incomplete. They're incomplete. They're basically a snapshot, a perception in time of some place, somewhere, some social ill. And then we use it, like I said, to kind of to generalize across 1.5 billion Muslims across history. And we're talking to an audience, and I don't know how many of you have any knowledge or any interaction or any kind of engagement with the Muslim community. So you don't have that to kind of gauge what is being said about Muslims. Like she said, she can talk about, if I can say that, she said she mocked, Jesus. And then, in the Muslim community, people will mock other faiths because, if you're in the power, you can get away with it. But that has to be challenged, not because because if someone is not there, if there isn't a Christian there or someone else will go ahead and say, stop. Well, that type of speech can lead to the dehumanization of other people. And I think that's where the tension lies. How do we enter the speech? And are we open to recognizing that when we speak about others who don't have voice or equal platform to respond to us, what is our challenge for us as a university in that regard?
Okay, excellent points made fatwa. And then especially in terms of the marginalized, people who feel marginalized and oppressed. Like I want to go back teeny tiny bit about the world that is constantly changing and changing very fast. Sometimes we couldn't really understand what is going on, right? Let's go back a little bit. I believe from my perspective as an educator, there are a lot of confusions among many of us of how to deal with the authors, right? Naturally speaking, as a human being, when grow up in the society, we tend to define ourselves, our own identity against the author. We grow up, we see us and them, the in-group and the out-group members, and how do we, sometimes we understand ourselves by seeing why the other people are different from us, right? And then there's so much confusion. And like Fatwa said, oftentimes we don't challenge ourselves to go out of our comfort zone to interact directly with people of the other culture. So a lot of us judge the other groups based on the stereotypes where in the media, right? And oftentimes we use these stereotypes to maybe confirm or reconfirm our own identity even and keep, accumulating. We learn about this, right? Since we are young until maybe 15, 25, 35, 45 until, right? So there's so much confusion within our community and the changing world. In addition, we lacked the way to communicate our own viewpoints. And when we are in the dominant group, like I mentioned this before, we don't feel the pain of the groups who might believe they're being marginalized. And there are studies quite a bit around the world. Oftentimes, when people do not feel like they're being recognized, oftentimes they feel they're being marginalized, they respond differently in order to make their voice heard if they are not being given the platform that they feel they deserve. I hope this makes sense to you. However, everyone makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, and we learn from the mistakes that we make on the daily basis. That's why we can keep this dialogue ongoing about when we think about the future, how are we going to create openness? The sense, how are we going actually communicate our sincerity, our goodwill of what we feel about the author instead of separating what we perceive as us and them. I think that is the point that the university or the institutions will have to think and communicate. Not shutting off any group of people, and on top of that, reinforcing what Fatwa said, providing a bigger platform opportunities for the people who believe they are being marginalized and humiliated on a daily basis. How are we going to accommodate that? And then how are we going, as the dominant group, open up to allowing those things to happen? Right? What are the resources that we could provide for them to show them that we have the sincerity and the goodwill? Because the end result is good for everybody.
Well, unfortunately for me, the cosmos put me in a position where I'm a white male in the dominant culture and I work for a newspaper. I can say what I want and millions of people will see it. But that, according to your argument, that would mean I couldn't talk about anybody. You know, I do have opinions. You know, I have had all of those advantages in my life, and I do have that platform. And yes, I agree that oftentimes people use speech in a way that is racist or offensive, evil, disgusting. But you can't pick and choose who should be allowed to speak or what they should be allowed to speak about. For the last 3 years, I've attended a cartoon festival in France, and I met a lot of cartoonists from all over the world. And when we go to these, we have displays of our work. And I've seen work by cartoonists in Asia and Africa and South America and Europe and the Slovakia, everywhere. And it's quite amazing. And I see work that impresses me, and I see work that disgusts me. I see opinions that I would never want to see printed in our paper. I've seen cartoons by Palestinian cartoonists about Jews that I don't find justifiable. But I would never say you can't do that. When something is expressed that people find offensive, someone else can disagree. They can express their own viewpoint. They might not have the same equal platform. That's life. Life is not fair. You have to find a way to express yourself. If you don't have a nice newspaper that lets you do cartoons like I do, you can write letters to the editor. You can organize demonstrations. You can organize calls for someone to be fired. You can encourage someone in your own community to find some way of expressing that disagreement. But to weigh whether someone is too dominant to talk about another person, I just don't see how that would work. To me, you have to answer speech you disagree with more speech. And I guess that's it.
Well, this, to some degree, sort of piggybacks off of and finds some common ground, I think, with each of the comments already made. So first, I mean, where I absolutely do find common ground with what Fetwa said and stated very well, is that, you know, it doesn't benefit any of us to pretend when we talk about the marketplace of ideas that it's completely structurally and culturally equal, right? And I think that is a very fair criticism that is often raised. And again, I say this as a card-carrying member of the ACLU, very proud, you know, sort of free speech liberal. But nonetheless, I think one very fair criticism that's often made of the justification, when a justification for free speech is that, well, you know, it's all thrown into the marketplace of ideas and we all get our voice and then the best ideas will rise to the top. Very fair criticism is, well, you know, the market is to mix my metaphors, it's, you know, it's not on an even playing field, it's stacked, not everybody has its loud voice. That's absolutely right. It's very important to recognize, right? There are cultural inequities, some of which have been touched on, definitely structural inequities in terms of who has access to the most effective media, who has the most money. Crucial to acknowledge, right? In terms of what you do about it, though, in terms of what you do about it, I do find myself largely agreeing with Steve when it comes to the question of, well, is one response to, you know, for the authority, whether it's, you know, the university writ large, if we're talking about campus speech codes, or whether it's government in its sovereign capacity, when we're talking about, you know, managing our day-to-day affairs. I don't think the answer can be that the government can make substantive judgments, or the, you know, university authorities acting in sort of a governing capacity should make substantive judgments about, who was already so structurally empowered that they shouldn't speak, or at least can be subject to more restrictions. If anything, for many of the same reasons of structural and cultural inequalities, I'd be very, very nervous about giving the government that represents, the society that bears those same inequalities to make these types of decisions, right? Who is it that they're likely to be oppressing? With whom are they likely to find favor? But again, sort of getting back to my earlier comments, that doesn't mean there's absolutely nothing that can be done. I mean, one thing, and this is sort of a soft suggestion in the sense that it's not a matter of implementing anything formal, and it would be a very kind of grassroots, very case by case, person by person, conversation by conversation approach. But I do think simply having awareness that the speech marketplace is somewhat stacked is helpful, so that, for example, when you get into these debates, like some that I was referring to before, where a group says, I not only have a right to say that, but you criticizing me is oppressive to me, right? Then to the extent that, one response might be, well, actually, censoring and counterspeaking are two very different things, and also understand that while you have a right to say this, you're really coming from a position of tremendous power, and so your claim that counterspeech somehow marginalizes you is problematic. I think that can be a useful contribution, but more so to the extent that we're talking about colleges and universities in particular. Again, I think there are things that the university can do. The university authorities, deans, et cetera, can certainly use their own speech, for example, to condemn inequities, even if not to shut down other particular instances of speech. They can put together panels, right, and try to ensure sort of wide representation on those panels, et cetera. So, it's very complicated, and I do think it is essential both to recognize the inequities of the speech marketplace, but at the same time, in my view, not to give into the temptation to say, oh, well, then from above, through a governing authority, we can kind of rejigger it. Finally, just to kind of say a word more directly about the starting point when Kim asked us about if there's something in particular about religion that creates an incompatibility with free speech. Here, too, I think my answer would largely echo what Fetwa said in responding to that, which is I don't think it's inherently the case that religion is incompatible with or less compatible with free speech than other things. I think it really does get back to certainty, right? And I think there are certain people, certain groups, certain charismatic figures, I say that in an ominous way, who will use a lot of themes and ideologies, whether politics or religion or otherwise, right, to try to persuade people that they are absolutely right. They have the answer. And it is so very certain that it's safe to shut down opposing speech, maybe even a necessity to violently shut down opposing speech. And yes, that's something religion is vulnerable to. But again, I think that's something a lot of topics are vulnerable to, including deeply held political views.
So thank you.
Kim, just a second. Can I add just very briefly to what Heidi said? It's not the religion per se, though. I think it's the politicizing of the religious ideology. Oftentimes, because if people are aware of the religious core, most of the time it's completely different from the political aspects of how the religious or practices have been taught or indoctrinated. It's completely two different things. I want that point across. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Anne has got a microphone. We're going to ask you to use the microphone to ask your question since we're recording.
Hi, my name is Sadaf and I'm a graduate student at the College of Education and Human Development. And I have been deeply engaged into what happened at the University of Minnesota after University of Minnesota powerful people held that panel, Charlie Hebdo, satire and free speech after Charlie Hebdo. And thank you very much to the Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action Office to hold this panel today. The question that I raised at that time that I want to raise today too in response to you when you said, can someone be too dominant to talk about the other people? And the response of speech should be response. The response of the speech should be speech, right? The question again is, what happened to the speech of Muslim students at the University of Minnesota that they did in response to powerful dean, faculty member, 12 departments? What happened to our speech? What was the response that came to us? These powerful departments that kept going into different newspapers and started saying that free speech has been attacked by Muslims at the University of Minnesota. And our request got into trash bin. So again, it raises many questions. One is like, what are the people, marginalized group, is really at the position to talk? And what comes as a response to our talk? I, being a Muslim woman, wearing hijab, moving around in the university with my Muslim identity, which I chose to have, I feel vulnerable. One response came, why did Muslim students did not go to the faculty member who did this event? My response is, if as a Muslim, I go there and I really assert my point of view, I have this fear that I would be accused of harassing or creating some terrorism based on all the stereotypes that are around in this atmosphere already. Second question, people who held this panel here are faculty members, researchers, academicians, really like learned people. They have the power to speak, they can speak, but that does not mean they should speak without knowing what their speech is doing to who and how. When Dean College of Liberal Arts, faculty, and other university resources put up this panel, and as a result, when Muslim students just file a petition, they go around in university newspaper, Star Tribune, Washington Post, Journal of Higher Ed, everywhere slamming Muslims' right to defend their religious identities and their religious sensitivities. I guess it gives a very strong message to Muslim community in the university. So the question is not whether free speech and religions are in collision with each other. The question is, what is the role of university? What kind of sense of responsibility, ethical and moral training can university give to its faculty and students about free speech? How can university teach its people to use free speech in a way that it does not become an attacker or marginalizer for the marginalized people already? Thank you.
Yes, I was at that panel, and let me explain, this is not to duck your question, but I'm not on the faculty and I did not organize that event. I was invited to speak on a panel with 3 other people, and it was in response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France. I still haven't seen the poster that caused the controversy, and I am not familiar with all of the formal complaints that were filed in regard to that. I am not sure exactly what response you wanted, what you would find to be an acceptable response to your complaint. You mentioned moral and ethical training for the faculty of the U of M. Is it beyond that? What kind of moral and ethical training would be an adequate response to your complaint? Yes, I'm asking you. I'd like to know.
Yeah, hold on. Excuse me.
All right, so there are a couple of things that you said. One thing that you said yet that you didn't see that poster. Okay. That poster, those who've not seen, the promotional flyer for Charlie Hebdo thing, 40%, more than 40% of that flyer was the caricature of my prophet, the same caricature which Charlie Hebdo magazine published right after French massacre. So 40% of that flyer was the caricature of the prophet. And it was nothing new for the faculty at the University of Minnesota. People all around the world know that publishing such caricatures hurt Muslims. And after that, if knowing all those things that are happening, if faculty still chooses to reproduce those caricatures here at the university and the top of that flyer, the poster that went around everywhere, and it's still on university internet, the top was University of Minnesota College of Liberal Arts, which means that is coming from the position of power, right? Also, the second thing, that poster was present on a really projected way in that venue as well. So the poster was present, and that is still present today. What response did I want? From number one, the report was not responded at all. It did not address anything. That is a separate issue. The response, minimum response that Muslim students at the University of Minnesota wanted, an apology from the faculty, knowing that this is such a hurtful topic, and knowing all the consequences in the history again and again, faculty is again doing the same act at the University of Minnesota platform. They are insensitive to the religious beliefs of Muslims. The same event could have held without that caricature. Some sensitivity training to the faculty should have happened, and that did not happen at all.
Fedwa, did you want to make a response to both of these remarks?
I was not at that panel, but I would like to say that's a perfect example of what I'm referring to about voice is a form of power, how you use it, and who's it used against, because it is a form of power. Who has it? How is it being used? This was an event that took place in France. We took a snapshot. It's kind of like, how you take a photo, you crop a certain part, and then you go ahead and you amplify. And that event had many events that took place, but there was a bigger, if we look at the whole picture, the police officer that died protecting Charlie Hebdo was Muslim. So we just took Charlie Hebdo and then we made him to be the saintly figure for free speech. And when the person who really died protecting him and his right for free speech was Muslim, but there were no conversations across any university about that police officer. Does anybody know anything about him, his family? Was there any conversation that took place that opened up about that police officer, Ahmed, and that he went out of his way, sacrificing his life, protecting a man who himself wanted to challenge others in a racist manner, but did not want to be challenged because when someone said something anti-Semitic, he did kick him out of his paper. He fired him. So again, how you enter the conversation. Here was somebody who, if we look at domestic violence, we would say that this person falls under a domestic violence abuser who was constantly belittling, making others people feel inferior. He died. He was killed. That was a tragic event. We should not glorify somebody who made other people feel inferior. That event is wrong. We need to condemn the event, condemn the attackers. But the real person who was really the protector of free speech, Ahmed, he just kind of was like under the carpet, and then we took this violent abuser in an emotional way, and then we made him into a saintly figure, and that's where the collision took place, I think. The tension is that, are we entering the conversation with desiring to fix others, control others, put people down, and kind of show that we're this enlightened group? Or are we entering the conversation as human beings, vulnerable? We want to challenge and be challenged. We want to grow. It's really about emotional blackmail. I don't know if anyone has read the books by Susan Forward, Emotional Blackmail, How to Set Boundaries. I don't think it's about limiting free speech or limiting religion. I think we need to understand the difference between emotional blackmail, emotional intelligence. We need to understand the difference between verbal abuse and social abuse, as well as social intelligence. I think if we kind of understand those realities and just how the reality that we live in and how we enter the conversation, being challenged and challenging others, I think a lot of that tension would go away.
So is there another question in the back here on this side?
Okay, I just want to say that just to follow up on what has been said, that Ahmed is certainly a hero, but as everybody knows, and as you probably know, he was not killed as a Muslim, right? However, Charlie Hebdo were killed as people who were exerting their freedom of speech. Now, Kim Hewitt has mentioned an incident that took place a couple of weeks ago with Moshe Halbertal, who was shouted down by a group of students who were opposing his speech about ethics and war. And I would like to have the opinion of the panelists about whether shouting down an Israeli intellectual belongs to counter speech, or is it something altogether different, such as censorship or intimidation or cultural hooliganism?
Before we get to that, could I just go back to this Charlie Hebdo topic briefly? First of all, at that panel, I did mention the policeman who was killed. I did not mention that he was Muslim. I mentioned it because my son is a policeman, and that was another reason why I was feeling very emotional about that. I also knew two of the killed cartoonists. Regarding the poster, I am certain that the faculty members who chose that image, upon learning of the hurt and pain that you expressed and other people expressed, regret their decision. I believe if they knew ahead of time that it would have had that reaction, that they would not have used it. I cannot say that for sure. I'm not them. I don't know her other than as an acquaintance. But that said, I mean, let me walk you through how a clueless non-Muslim might come to that choice. Because what the panel was in response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Charlie Hebdo is the name of the magazine. It's not one person. It was 4 cartoonists who were killed. None of them named Charlie. But the images, the image of the prophet that was on the cover of the subsequent Charlie Hebdo editions was printed all over the world. It was in magazines, it was in newspapers, it was on television, it was all over social media. It was like that. Many people in support of free speech use that image as their icon for their Facebook page. You may have seen it. I did, everywhere. Twitter, you name the social platform, that image was everywhere. So it struck me as yes, it may have been insensitive, but to someone who is a non-Muslim, which I believe the organizers were, to have a panel about Charlie Hebdo using that image by Charlie Hebdo that was all over the world seems like it's something you would expect. It doesn't seem out of line. If you didn't have in your mind that this will be offensive to some of our students and faculty, if that didn't cross your mind, it wouldn't, I don't think it was chosen as an insult. I don't think it was chosen to intentionally inflict pain. I think it was, the pain was inadvertent. They wanted to advertise a panel discussing free speech. They did not want to organize a panel to spread hate and division. No, you shake your head, and that's what I think. I don't know. I don't.
I'm not talking about any Tom, Dick, and Harry all around the world. I'm talking about academic elites, researchers, highly sophisticated people who deal with 50,000 students here who are supposed to be very at the top level of sophistication when it comes to sensitivities of the people and moral and ethical obligations.
So can I jump in? I'm going to jump in.
You can have very high.
Wait, excuse me, I think we should go back to the question that was asked in the back about counter speech and the issue of the Israeli speaker who was at the law school. So maybe.
Can I just say at this point, I'd like to try to get in other voices.
Right.
Even though, not of the panelists necessarily, but just so that we can get as many voices in the audience in as possible rather than a back and forth, just because we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, so I think it would be good to go back to the topic that was raised. Heidi, do you want to take that one?
Sure. And I should say I'm on the law school faculty. I actually was not at that event, so I can't. So my knowledge of what happened is based on partly what was reported, but also I did talk to colleagues who were at the event, and I got, I think, a pretty detailed accounting of what happened at the protest. I think this just cut off, or it came back. Okay. So please feel free, if anyone was there, to correct me if I say something that assumes an incorrect fact, but based on what I was told about the event. So based on what I was told, oh, sure, this is going in and out. Based on what I was told, oh, thank you. As it was described to me by a colleague, I was told there were a few stages of the protest. First, that there were protesters outside as people walked in. Then that there were students who dispersed throughout the auditorium, and one by one, as the introduction was being made of the speaker, began to, I guess, shout over the person doing the introducing. One by one, each student was led outside. Then another would start speaking. Then they were let outside. I was told this took about half an hour. And then some of the students outside also started chanting. So it was hard to hear inside. So based on those premises, this is actually not what I have in mind when I talk about counter speech, to the extent that it's about making it physically impossible to hear someone else's speech in the first place. I think that really is a situation where the speech is really designed to sort of stamp out the other speech. So insofar as that was about preventing the speaker from being heard, I don't think that is a desirable form of counter speech. What are alternatives, right? I think certainly protesting in front of the venue, which I'm told was part of it, is absolutely legitimate. I think even protesting outside of the venue, perhaps verbally before the event began, and then so as to let the event go forward and let the person be heard, perhaps with signs while it's going on. I also, when I was a law student, I have a memory of one event where I witnessed what I thought was a very good, clever way of counter-speaking in an event. This is actually sort of interesting. This was 1993, so it wasn't far after the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings. And someone named David Brock, who actually now is a liberal media commentator, but at the time was a conservative media commentator and had written a book called The Real Anita Hill, which is a very hot button issue. And I remember a number of students wanted to protest him, but among the protesters, a number of them said, well, we don't want to shut down the speech. So the solution they came up with was that they printed up signs with various choice phrases, such as liar, or read footnote 92, it's a lie, things like that. Very, very kind of pedantic law student type of counter speech. And at appropriate moments during the talk would hold up the signs. Now, some might say that in itself is disrespectful, disruptive. I can actually get behind that. It creates discomfort. I'm sure it was uncomfortable for the speaker, but that I think is not over the line insofar as it still lets the speaker speak.
Thank you. So do we have some other?
Just to add to that, being that I'm also like Palestinian, I agree that we don't need to shut down speech on controversial ideas. I disagree that when people engage in war, they engage in war crimes, they have a habit of coming to the United States and other universities to try to rationalize and to justify these war crimes. And we have seen that to be a habit with Israeli officials. They would get paid as much as $70,000 by universities to come and make a presentation to try to defend the war in Gaza, to try to defend other war crimes of children dying from white phosphorus, all types of war crimes, trying to defend the Israeli Defense Army, trying to do anything that they can to create some sort of defense and rationalization. People that have gone to the UN and have been silenced by the UN. The Goldstone report, for example, has met tremendous criticism. Even himself, who judge and a known Zionist, was shut down by the very community. And then they got upset when people went to universities and said, if you are not open to investigation, you are not open to accountability, you are not open to even listening from a judge and investigators, then we are going to come and face you with the names of the victims, and we're going to shut you down. I don't think that that is cultural hooligans. I think that is accountability. I think that is responsibility. We cannot allow people to come to universities trying to create a defense and some sort of rationalization for war crimes. So I apologize, but I disagree. No, I do not. I condemn it.
So let's go on to another question. Do you want to go on?
Hi. Well, thank you for having this panel. I have been playing, I've heard about a few little news kerfuffles with various speakers being disinvited from universities to speak, and that seems really counterproductive to and I think due to pressure from student groups, and that seems very counterproductive. And I was wondering if there was a way that universities could actually try and have more speakers. And so if there's a student group that is having some controversial speaker and then having another student group to have a response and or maybe separate events concurrently, or because I see that what you're talking about, Fedwa was talking about, giving people equal platform, but having this conversation, because I can't remember who said this, but there was someone who's like, it's the mark of an educated person to be able to hear an idea and then reject it. And I feel like people at the university, whether or not they're students or members of the public, are intelligent enough that they are, I don't know, able to be hearing opposing viewpoints. And so I was wondering what ways that specifically the university could foster those equal platforms.
Someone want to take that one?
Sure. Is this working? Okay. So a couple things. One is absolutely, I mean, I very much like the idea, obviously, of trying to broaden base of speakers, et cetera. So in principle, yeah, I'm all for that. That said, right, there are limits just on the logistical capacity to do that, on funding capacity, on space, and on time. So for that reason, I do want to say, and this also relates back to the last question, but I think is responsive to this as well, that I do think it's one thing to suggest that, well, you know, it's not a legitimate form of counter speech to shut down a speaker. I think that is a different thing from saying that students have no right to have input into who should get limited speaking spots or positions of honor or compensation from the university. So, you know, I say that again, sort of responsive to both questions, that I do think it's entirely valid for students as well as other faculty, members of the community, other stakeholders to say, look, to the extent that there are only X or Y slots, unless they really are just being made first come, first serve, which very often they're not, right? Often there is some kind of content-based election based on who the university or different groups think is worthwhile, suggesting that they want more input into that. And certainly to the extent that there's money given to speakers, I think that's very fair, right? That's part of dialogue, right? To question whether the university is making good judgments. So that obviously it relates to the last question, but the way it relates to yours is to say, yeah, in the ideal world, you know, everything could be turned into a multi-speaker forum. Given the limitations of time, space, money, choices do have to be made. One option is to say, it's just all first come, first serve. You know, the university should make no content-based judgments about who comes. Realistically, there will be pedagogical, intellectual, other judgments. And I think it's a completely legitimate criticism for student groups or faculty members or others to make, to suggest that they don't like the way those decisions are made or that they think bad decisions have been made.
Thank you. So we have a question right here.
It's not a question. It's putting something on the agenda. You have mentioned 3 contentious issues in the last year at the university. I would like to mention one which is just going on right now. This is the issue of the Minnesota Student Association, which apparently rejected a resolution to mourn 9/11. I received, to my surprise, I'm both a faculty and an alumna. And I received, to my amazement yesterday, a message telling me that basically the dialogue with the student organization was shut down. The president had made the decision that this commemoration would be observed. Now, as you say, it's maybe his prerogative, but the student association actually had not resolved to reject wholesale this resolution, but to revisit it in a week and to see how it could be implemented while taking into account the concerns raised by some of the Muslim student association. And it seemed to me a very healthy process. This organization has only advisory power. And so I'm just saying, I wish the administration would find a way to encourage this dialogue. And I have a student of mine who is involved as a mediator, you know, because it's a precious process.
Thank you. Do we have another question? I think.
I have a student over here, or
Okay.
sorry, don't know if you're a student, but a young person. Okay.
We'll see if you can all see me. A more recent topic that I believe we should also be discussing is, I'll tell it to you in a little bit of a story form. So imagine getting off the connector at 8 a.m., getting ready to go to your 9 a.m. class, and the very first thing you see on the billboard is another depiction of the prophet, but this time as a pig, and being said that it is the prophet, the pig of all prophets. This happened 2 weeks ago, and luckily students, knowing the reaction that would occur, took down the posters because it's so offensive to a Muslim student, doesn't make you feel welcome. And this is one of many things that occur on this university on the platform of free speech. But what doesn't happen is you don't get to talk about it. You don't know who did it. They don't come to Muslim students and say, this is how I feel, let me tell you. They say, let me draw it and not put my name on it and not be held accountable for my actions. And so I won't ask the question, my friend will. So
yeah, as my friend was saying, there was no student group or event, no discussion attached to this photo. It was put up clearly with malicious intent there to be seen, and it was clearly meant to have a reaction. And I guess our question to the panel is, as students who appreciate and want open discussions, how can we be expected to want to be at that table when we see things like this on a day-to-day basis? How can we feel safe contributing in this community? And where do we draw the line at hate speech and free speech?
Does someone want to take, that was actually going to be one of our questions if we had time. So,
Well, I would just say that the world is an ugly place, and there are people out there who are bigots and racists, and they wanted to make you feel exactly how you feel. They wanted to make you feel unwelcome and marginalized. And that's unfortunate. That's the world we have. And as I keep saying, the only way we can answer this is with our own speech. And how can you answer someone who is anonymous, who puts things up in the night? That's a viciousness that I don't have an answer for. But as far as feeling like, how can I feel like I can still participate and feel welcome? You have to make yourself participate. You have to fight. I mean, it wasn't easy for Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Mandela. It didn't happen overnight, and they faced incredible odds. And, in the end, I like to think that people will improve. People will learn. And by speaking to each other and continuing to press our concerns, whether we agree or not, eventually it will get through. But I would just encourage you not to succumb to the fear that they tried to instill in you, and just recognize that, yeah, there are rotten people out there, but there are also good people willing to hear.
did you want to respond?
Yeah, I agree with Steve. I think the conversation also has to, even if we don't hear them, and the voices that are always loud are always the most obnoxious voices at times, not all the times, but at times, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are good people that do not hold these views. Sometimes they are just silent, but like Steve said, that he feels disgust towards such people. But to reiterate what he said, people change. And I think one of our co-panelists here said that she used to mock, Jesus Christ, because, sometimes people act out of ignorance. And I'm not saying that she's ignorant, but I'll say I was ignorant quite a few times in my life. And I said things and people challenged me. And, at times there was resistance. But then when you sat back, you're like, yeah, I think I was wrong. I was dead wrong. So I think also recognize that at times it could be just ignorance, arrogance, it could be, but there has to be that challenge. And then you have to, at times you got to see, I was surprised at times that you would see people that, you fought with for 10 years over your, they would argue back and forth with you. Then after 10 years, they would write to you and they would say, hey, how are you doing? It's me, do you remember? And then they would act like they were your friend. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to basically set boundaries to protect yourself from such individuals, because they may be setting out to hurt you. You can work with the Council of American Islamic Relations. In Minnesota, there's a chapter. But you don't want to lose sight of the fact that he's also representative of everybody in the community. We don't want to do kind of as Muslims what? Like kind of generalize and say that this person represents everybody out there. So we have to also speak up and recognize there are a lot of people that don't hold those views.
And just if I may, one more quick anecdote from my law school years. I remember my first year of law school, there was an incident with someone, some anonymous person, posting the N-word in a couple of locations, and I was at the time on the Journal of Law and Feminism, and I remember it came up in our journal meeting. We should have some kind of response. What should we do? And there were a number of people who wanted to kind of call for pulling down the postings. And what we decided to do instead, a large group of us, was to create a bunch of counter posters. And I still remember our tagline was a reminder of where bigotry leads us, with photos of just horrific instances from American history, lynchings, violence during the civil rights movement, et cetera. And I think we felt that we'd had some effect, but I actually think, and this kind of gets to what Fetwa was saying about, you might have allies in places you don't expect. I think it was a real bonding experience in a way that was pretty empowering across different racial groups, for us to sort of help one another with that counter speech effort.
Okay, again, let me tell you about from an outsider perspective. One, I'm not at the University of Minnesota. Two, I'm not very religious per se, right? And when I'm looking at the global picture, when we think about it, even I'm teaching media studies, I'm directing the international journalism program. But when we are looking at the speech or free speech or hate speech per se, the problems might not be about the speech per se. It could be based on issues that underline that particular speech and then perception about that particular speech. Social, economic, political, cultural system that the speech is embedded in. When we are looking at the problems in France, Charlie Hebdo, or the Paris attacks that happened last week, it could be related to the ongoing immigration policy in France. It could be about foreign policy, not individuals per se or particular speech per se. I really want to emphasize this global perspective. So when we want to get out of the comfort zone and understand the author, please do learn and educate ourselves about what's going on around the world as well, not just within Minnesota, because in the end, it's simply maybe a replica of what is the bigger issues out there in the world. And this is just an example. This is what I see very clear as from an outsider perspective. Thank you.
So thank you to our panelists, and thank you, audience, for your engagement and your patience around this really, I think, challenging and complicated topic. So thank you all.